Death has been a constant in human history, an inevitable event that transcends cultures, times, and places. However, the way societies have dealt with death, especially in their funeral rituals, reveals much about their beliefs, fears, and expectations about what comes after. This account will explore some of the strangest funeral rituals of the ancient world, practices that may seem grotesque or incomprehensible to modern eyes, but in their time held deep spiritual and cultural meaning. Chapter 1: Egyptian Mummification, the Quest for Eternal Life. The Egyptian civilization is known for its obsession with the afterlife, and mummification is perhaps the most emblematic funeral ritual of their culture. For the Egyptians, death was not the end, but the beginning of a journey to eternity. But for the soul to safely pass to the afterlife, the body had to be perfectly preserved. This is where mummification comes into play, a complex and deeply ritualized process that could last up to 70 days. The Temple of Anubis, the god of mummification and guardian of the dead, becomes the setting for this sacred ritual. The priests, dressed in white robes and carrying protective amulets, begin the process with a series of prayers and chants. The mummification process starts with the removal of internal organs, which were considered susceptible to decomposition. The brain, seen as useless for life in the afterlife, was extracted through the nostrils using a metal hook. The heart was often left in place, as it would be needed for the final judgment before Osiris, the god of the underworld. The other vital organs were removed to be treated and placed in canopic jars, each protected by a guardian god: Hapi, Duamutef, Imseti, and Kabesanuf, and buried alongside the body. This process had spiritual significance, as it was believed the organs played a role in the final judgment, where the deceased soul would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. The body was then dehydrated using natron, a natural salt that removed moisture, preserving the tissues for eternity and preventing decay. This dehydration process could last from 40 to 60 days. During this time, the priest recited hymns and prayers, pleading for the soul and its safe passage to the afterlife. Afterward, the body was carefully wrapped in linen bandages. Each layer of bandages was impregnated with resins and perfumed oils, which not only helped preserve the body but also protected it from evil spirits. The priest placed amulets and talismans between the layers of bandages, each with a specific purpose: to protect the body, guide its soul, and ensure its resurrection. These bandages not only served to protect the body, but also to ensure that the deceased had the necessary tools to face the challenges of the afterlife. Finally, the body was placed in a sarcophagus, adorned with hieroglyphics narrating the person's life and deeds. The sarcophagus was a work of art in itself, with intricate carvings and paintings depicting scenes from the person's life and their journey to the afterlife. The sarcophagus was sealed and taken to the tomb. Egyptian tombs were monuments that reflected their social status and their belief in eternal life. Pharaohs and nobles were buried in tombs filled with valuables, food, and offerings, all intended to be used in the afterlife. These objects were not mere decorations. Each had a symbolic or practical purpose, ensuring that the deceased could live in the afterlife with the same luxury they had enjoyed on earth. Once in the afterlife, the soul would face the judgment of Osiris, where its heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was pure, the person would be welcomed into the fields of Aru, the eternal paradise. If not, their soul would be devoured by Ammit, the soul-devouring monster. Mummification not only preserved the body, but also ensured its legacy. Through this sacred ritual, the person became an eternal being, remembered and venerated by future generations. Their tomb, a testament to their greatness and devotion, became a place of pilgrimage, where the living honored the dead and sought the blessing of the gods. Chapter 2: The ancestor cult in China. Veneration and sacrifice. In ancient China, the ancestor cult was more than just a tradition. It was the core of social, political, and religious life. They believed that the spirits of ancestors could influence the lives of the living, either to bless or curse them. For this reason, rigorous and continuous worship was performed, which included sacrifices and offerings to maintain their favor. Chinese funeral rituals were elaborate ceremonies that began long before death. The design of the tomb, the choice of burial objects, and the planning of sacrifices were crucial decisions that reflected the status of the deceased and the importance of maintaining social order beyond death. Tombs, especially those of nobility, were architectural complexes that often mimicked the homes or palaces where the deceased had lived. These spaces were not only meant to protect the body, but also to house the soul, which, according to Chinese beliefs, could wander if it did not find itself in a familiar and appropriate environment. One of the strangest aspects of these rituals was the sacrifice of servants and concubines, who were buried alongside their master to serve him in the afterlife. This act was seen as an honor for both the deceased and those sacrificed, as it was believed that accompanying a noble or a king in death guaranteed a privileged place in the afterlife. Furthermore, the sacrifices were a demonstration of the deceased's power and wealth, reinforcing their status even after death. After the funeral, offerings continued. Descendants regularly performed rituals at family altars, presenting food, wine, and symbolic objects to appease the spirits and ensure their protection. These rituals maintained the bond between the living and the dead, reinforcing the importance of family and the continuity of lineage over time. The ancestor cult in China is a practice that has survived through the centuries, adapting to social and cultural changes while maintaining its essence. It is an expression of respect, gratitude, and love, a way to keep the memory of the departed alive and ensure the continuity of life. Through veneration and sacrifice, ancestors remain an integral part of Chinese family life, guiding and protecting them on their journey. Chapter 3: The Funeral of Kings in Sumer, the Feast of Death. In the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, stood the ancient city of Ur, located in what we now know as Iraq, one of the earliest civilizations recorded in human history. This city, one of the most powerful in Sumer, was home to great kings and queens who ruled with wisdom and strength. When a king dies, his funeral becomes a grand event, a feast of death that reflects his power and legacy. The Sumerians developed a rich and complex culture, and their funeral practices reflected their unique view of death and the afterlife. One of the strangest and most fascinating rituals of the civilization was the burial of kings, accompanied by a macabre banquet that included the sacrifice of their servants and courtiers. When a king passed away, news of his death spread through the city, and preparations for his funeral began immediately. In the great ziggurat of Ur, a temple dedicated to the moon god Nana, priests gathered to plan the ritual that would ensure the king's passage to the afterlife. The body was prepared with great care. Embalmers washed and anointed it with perfumed oils, preserving it for eternity. It was then dressed in fine clothes and adorned with jewelry and amulets, symbolizing the king's status and power. The body was placed in a stone sarcophagus, carved with scenes of his life and accomplishments. On the day of the funeral, the city of Ur was filled with activity. Citizens gathered in the streets, bringing offerings and singing hymns in honor of the deceased king. In the ziggurat, priests performed animal sacrifices, offering their blood and flesh to the gods to ensure divine favor. The air filled with the scent of incense and the sound of drums and flutes. The king's sarcophagus was carried in a solemn procession to the royal tomb, an underground structure resembling a palace. Inside, the tomb was filled with treasures: gold, silver, precious stones, weapons, and luxury utensils. These objects would accompany the king on his journey to the afterlife, ensuring that he would have everything he needed in the next life. One of the most impressive aspects of the funeral of kings in Sumer was the Feast of Death. In a large room within the tomb, a table was set with abundant food and drink. The king's servants and courtiers, dressed in their finest attire, sat at the table and participated in a ceremonial banquet. During the banquet, poems were recited, and stories of the king's deeds were told, celebrating his life and legacy. However, the Feast of Death had a darker purpose. The servants and courtiers participating in the banquet were sacrificed at the end of the ceremony so that they could accompany the king in the afterlife. This sacrifice was seen as an honor, a way of showing loyalty and devotion to the king even in death, and as a way of securing a privileged place in the afterlife. The bodies of the sacrifice were placed in the tomb alongside the king's sarcophagus, creating a royal court in the afterlife. The king's funeral culminated in a series of magical rituals performed by the priests. These rituals were designed to protect the soul and guide it on its journey to the underworld. Incantations were recited, and offerings were made to the gods of the underworld, pleading for the protection and guidance of the king in his new life. With the closing of the tomb, the king began his journey to the afterlife. In the darkness of the tomb, surrounded by treasures and accompanied by his loyal servants, the king prepared to face the challenges of the underworld and achieve immortality. In the city of Ur, life continued, but the memory of the king endured, immortalized in the stories and songs of his people. The Feast of Death was a celebration of the life and legacy of the kings, a way to ensure that their memory would last forever. Chapter 4: The Human Sacrifices of the Aztecs. Feeding the Gods. The Aztecs, one of the most powerful and advanced civilizations of Mesoamerica, are known for their human sacrifice rituals, which were a central and deeply rooted practice in their culture and religion. The Aztecs believed that the gods had sacrificed parts of themselves to create the world, and thus it was necessary to repay them through human sacrifices. For the Aztecs, life and death were intrinsically tied to natural cycles and the will of the gods. They believed that human sacrifice was necessary to maintain the balance of the universe and ensure the continuity of life on Earth. Sacrifices were carried out in elaborate ceremonies and rituals that involved the entire community. The victims, often prisoners of war, were taken to the tops of pyramids where priests performed the sacrifice. The victim's beating heart was extracted and offered to the gods, while the body was dismembered and, in some cases, ritually consumed. This act was seen as a way to release the vital energy that the gods needed to continue feeding the sun and ensure the fertility of the land. It was also considered an honor both for the victim and the community, as it was believed to secure the favor of the gods. Human sacrifices were not isolated events, but part of a complex ritual calendar that included numerous festivals and ceremonies. For example, during the festival of Toxcatl, a young man who had been selected and treated as a deity for an entire year was sacrificed. This young man, known as the Xiptla, represented the god Tezcatlipoca, and his sacrifice symbolized the renewal of the cycle of life and death. In addition to sacrifices on pyramids, the Aztecs also performed sacrifices in other contexts, such as on battlefields. Captured warriors were sacrificed in honor of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. These sacrifices were seen as a way to ensure victory in war and the fertility of the land. Sacrifice was not only an act of devotion, but also a means of maintaining control and instilling terror among their subjects and allies. The Aztecs used these rituals as a political tool, demonstrating their power and the divine blessing they received through the sacrifices. The victims, though terrified, were often viewed with a certain aura of respect, as it was believed they were being elevated to the status of divinity by being offered to the gods. Sacrifices were public events that involved the entire community and served to reinforce social cohesion and cultural identity. These were moments of intense spirituality during which the Aztecs strengthened their collective identity and their connection with the cosmos. Chapter 5: The Towers of Silence. In Persia, the Judgment of the Sun. In ancient Persia, the Zoroastrian religion practiced a funerary rite known as the Towers of Silence. This ritual was based on the belief that the human body, once dead, became impure and should not contaminate the sacred elements of earth, fire, and water. To prevent this contamination, bodies were taken to circular structures known as dakmas, or Towers of Silence. In these towers, bodies were exposed to the elements and scavenger birds, mainly vultures, which strip the flesh from the bones. This process, known as excarnation, allowed the remains of the deceased to be consumed quickly while also being purified by the sun and wind. Once the bones were clean, they were collected and placed in a central ossuary. This ritual not only ensured the purity of the elements, but also symbolized the judgment of the sun, which purified the soul of the deceased and prepared it for the afterlife. The Towers of Silence were located on hills or mountains to be closer to the sky. These structures were designed to facilitate access for scavenger birds and to allow the excarnation process to occur efficiently. Zoroastrians believed that the birds, by consuming the remains, released the soul of the deceased and carried it to the heavens. The ritual of the Towers of Silence also had a communal component. The family and friends of the deceased participated in the process, bringing the body to the tower and performing prayers and rituals to ensure the well-being of the soul. This act of farewell was a way to show respect and love for the deceased, as well as to reaffirm their faith in the teachings of Zoroaster. Zoroastrians believed in a judgment after death, in which the soul of the deceased would be weighed to determine its fate in the afterlife. The exposure of the body in the Towers of Silence symbolized this judgment, where natural elements and scavenger animals determined the purity of the deceased. If the body was consumed quickly, it was seen as a sign of divine favor, while if it remained intact, it could be interpreted as a bad omen. The rite of the Towers of Silence also reflected the dualistic worldview of Zoroastrianism, which saw the world as a constant struggle between good and evil, purity and corruption. By disposing of the body in this manner, Zoroastrians believed they were helping to maintain cosmic order and strengthening the forces of good against evil. Over the centuries, the practice of the Towers of Silence has faced challenges and changes. With the arrival of Islam in Persia and the modernization of society, many Zoroastrians have adopted other forms of burial, such as cremation or burial in cemeteries. However, the Towers of Silence remain a powerful symbol of the Zoroastrian faith and its connection to nature and the cosmos. Chapter 6: Tree Burials of the Toraja, Elevating the Dead. On the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, the Toraja ethnic group has a unique funeral tradition that involves burial in trees, centered around the belief that the dead must be closer to the sky. The Toraja believe that trees are sacred and have the ability to connect the world of the living with that of the dead. This ritual reflects the Toraja's connection to nature and their belief in the continuity of life after death. For the Toraja, death is not an abrupt end, but a gradual process. After death, the body of the deceased is treated as if it were ill or sleeping, and is cared for by the family until the funeral can be held, which may take place months or even years after death. During this time, the body is preserved using traditional methods, and the family continues to interact with the deceased, offering food and drink. The funeral itself is a major community event that can last several days and includes animal sacrifices, such as buffalo and pigs, whose spirits accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. These sacrifices are a sign of respect and a way to ensure that the deceased has a safe and pleasant transition to the spirit world. During the funeral, there are also dances and songs, and elaborate temporary structures are built to house the guests and the spirits of the deceased. The Toraja believed that the soul of the deceased must be guided and protected on its journey to Puya, the realm of spirits. To ensure the soul reaches its destination, specific offerings and rituals are performed. For the Toraja, the dead must be physically closer to the gods, so coffins are placed high in trees or in niches carved into cliffs. These aerial tombs not only symbolize the elevation of the soul, but also protect the bodies from evil spirits and terrestrial animals. Children and babies, who have not yet developed a full connection to the earth, are buried inside cavities carved into the trunks of large trees, in an act symbolizing the hope that their spirit will grow and flourish in the afterlife. These tree burials not only physically elevate the dead, but also symbolize the Toraja's desire for the spirits of children to ascend to the sky. Over time, the tree grows and envelops the body, integrating the deceased into the natural cycle of life and death. The tradition of tree burials and other Toraja funeral rites has attracted the attention of anthropologists and tourists from around the world. Although modernization and social change have affected some of these practices, the Toraja continue to maintain and adapt their traditions, preserving their cultural identity and connection to the past. Chapter 7. The Funeral Rite of Suti in India. The Fire of Devotion. Suti, also known as sati, was a funeral practice in ancient India, in which a widow would immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre. This rite, which dates back to ancient times, was based on the belief that a wife's devotion to her husband should continue even after death. Immolation was seen as the ultimate sacrifice, demonstrating the wife's purity and fidelity, and ensuring the eternal union of the couple in the afterlife. The origin of suti can be found in ancient texts that mention the practice as an act of sacrifice and devotion. Over the centuries, suti became an ingrained tradition in some Hindu communities, particularly among the upper castes. It was believed that by immolating herself with her husband, the widow not only purified her own soul and that of her husband, but also ensured that they would be reborn together in the next life. This act also reflected the ideal of the Hindu woman as submissive and wholly dedicated to her husband, an ideal that was exploited to maintain social and religious control over women. Widows who underwent suti were venerated as martyrs and were believed to attain a state of purity and sanctity. The suti process involved a series of rituals and preparations. The widow, dressed in her finest clothes and adorned with jewelry, was taken in procession to the cremation site. There, prayers and offerings were made, and the widow was placed on the funeral pyre beside her husband's body. The fire, considered sacred in Hindu tradition, consumed both bodies, symbolizing the eternal union of the couple. Accounts of women who voluntarily immolated themselves, sometimes even with a smile on their face, were used as propaganda to glorify female sacrifice and devotion. In many communities, widows were seen as an economic and social burden, and suti offered a solution to this problem. By immolating herself, the widow not only demonstrated her devotion, but also freed her family from the responsibility of supporting her. This practical aspect of suti contributed to its persistence over the centuries. However, not all women who immolated themselves did so voluntarily. There are accounts of women being drugged with substances like opium or other sedatives to reduce their fear or resistance. In some cases, widows who were reluctant to perform suti were physically forced by their families or community members who carried them to the funeral pyre. In many cases, the psychological and social pressure was so strong that women felt they had no choice but to submit to suti, leading to debates about whether this ritual was truly an act of devotion or a form of oppression. During the British colonial period, suti was legally banned, but not without resistance, as many Hindus saw it as interference in their religious traditions. Despite the official ban, suti continued to be practiced in some regions of India for several years. Reports of clandestine suti cases emerge in various parts of the country, and British authorities face challenges in completely eradicating the practice. However, over time, social and legal pressure led to a gradual decline in the number of sati cases. Chapter 8: The Banquet of the Dead in Rome, a dinner with the departed. In ancient Rome, the Banquet of the Dead, known as Parentalia, was an annual festival dedicated to honoring deceased ancestors. During this celebration, families gathered at the tombs of their loved ones to share a meal in their honor, a meal in which it was believed that the soul of the deceased participated in some way. This banquet was not only a way to remember and pay homage to the dead, but also a means of keeping their memory alive and ensuring their well-being in the afterlife. The Romans believed that the spirits of the dead, known as manes, could influence the lives of the living, and it was important to keep them content. These meals were not only a moment to remember the deceased, but also to strengthen family bonds and ensure that the spirit of the departed did not feel forgotten or rejected, which could lead to their return as restless ghosts. This banquet reflected the Romans' connection to their ancestors and their belief in the continuity of life after death. The food offered at these banquets included bread, fruit, wine, and other symbolically important items. The tombs were decorated with garlands, and lamps were lit to guide the spirits on their way. Offerings were often left directly at the tomb or on a nearby altar, and wine was poured in libation over the earth, an act symbolizing the union between the living and the dead. This ritual, deeply rooted in Roman culture, showed that the dead remained part of everyday life, a natural extension of the family and community. Parentalia also included specific rituals to purify the tombs and protect the living from any negative influence. Priests performed purification ceremonies, and sacrifices were made in honor of the gods of the underworld. These rituals ensured that the spirits of the dead remained at peace and did not cause harm to the living. Over the centuries, the celebration of Parentalia evolved and was influenced by other traditions and religions. With the arrival of Christianity, many of the practices and beliefs associated with Parentalia were absorbed and transformed into new festivities and rituals. However, the spirit of honoring ancestors and keeping their memory alive has endured and remains an important part of many cultures and religions worldwide. Chapter 9: Sky Burials in Tibet, Returning the Body to the Earth. In Tibet, sky burials, or jadar, are a funeral practice in which the body of the deceased is offered to vultures. This rite is based on Buddhist beliefs of impermanence, the transmigration of the soul, and compassion, reflecting the idea that the body is merely a temporary vessel for the soul. By offering the body to the vultures, Tibetans believe they are returning the body to nature, allowing the cycle of life to continue and helping the soul detach from its earthly life to continue its journey towards nirvana or reincarnation. After death, the body is washed and wrapped in a white cloth. It is then taken to an elevated location, such as a hill or mountain, where the ritual takes place. During the sky burial, the body is dismembered by a specialist known as a rogyapa. Sacred vultures, revered in Tibetan culture, descend to consume the remains, thus completing the cycle of life and death. This rite not only frees the soul of the deceased, elevating it to the sky, but also provides food for the vultures, symbolizing impermanence on Earth and the interconnectedness of all forms of life. Family and friends of the deceased accompany the body and participate in prayers and ceremonies performed to ensure the well-being of the soul on its journey to the afterlife. This ritual also has a practical dimension, given the mountainous terrain and rocky soil of Tibet, where burial or cremation is difficult and costly. However, it is the spiritual significance that makes it truly unique, reflecting a connection to nature and an acceptance of death as part of the endless cycle of existence. Thank you so much for staying until the end of this video. If you enjoyed the content, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more stories. See you in the next video.